good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. My name's Richard Downey from the Africa program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And it's my pleasure here to welcome Bronwyn Bruton here from the Council on Foreign Relations, and she's going to talk today about a report she's just written for us on the subject of Somalia, with some very interesting thinking outside the box sort of ideas about Somalia. Bronwyn's a democracy and governance specialist and was between 2008 and 2009 an international affairs fellow in residence at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, she's worked at the National Endowment for Democracy, managing grants to non-governmental organizations, I think particularly in East and Southern Africa, including Somalia, is that right?
Yep.
And she's also worked for the USAID, their Office of Transition Initiatives as well. Bronwyn holds a MPP with honours from UCLA. And we welcome her here today to talk about her report, which I guess I just open with a couple of remarks and set the scene for Bronwyn. Talking about Somalia, and Somalia is an issue that US policymakers is a country that US policymakers have been scratching their heads over for such a long time now. The country, as you'll undoubtedly know, is perhaps a little more than an expression on the map, having had no central government for the best part of 2 decades. It's been pulled to pieces by civil war, clan conflict, invasion by its neighbour Ethiopia, and most recently by violent brands of religious extremists, some with links to Al-Qaeda. The body in charge of restoring order at the moment is the Transitional Federal Government. And to use the word government is stretching it a little bit far. It may have international support, but it doesn't have much authority currently on the ground. Nevertheless, the United States believes the TFG is the best, or frankly the only option in town right now, and it's been busily ramping up its assistance to the TFG, particularly in recent months, and its leader, Sheikh Sharif. So far, there's little to show for their efforts, and Bronwyn is going to take up the story now. In her new study for the Council on Foreign Relations, Somalia, A New Approach, she asked an important question of US policymakers, foreign policymakers. Is doing less sometimes the best option? And in what she calls constructive disengagement, she maps out the possible approach for the United States going forward. And even if it allows extremist Islamist militias, the Shabaab, to extend its control over Somalia. It's a very thought-provoking argument, and we're going to hear about it in more detail here today. So I'll pass over to Bronwyn, who can pick up the threads.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to a back and forth as we continue, so I don't have to talk consistently for so long. Basically, I wanted to start off by just exploring for a moment a fundamental question which is often overlooked in conversations about Somalia, which is, what is the problem in that country? We tend to be really distracted a lot of the time by Al-Qaeda and by pirate antics on the high seas. And those things tend to really distract from the core issues at play on the ground. We also have a tendency to describe the problem in Somalia using fairly academic terms like clan conflict or state failure, which again, they're accurate descriptions of the problem, but they're not really very evocative of what's causing the conflict. In a nutshell, Somalia suffered from a military dictatorship for 20 years, and most of its problems stem back to that period. Siad Barre, the military dictator, used a system of clan politics to maintain his hold on power, in which he systematically pitted Somalia's pretty much peaceful clans against each other, partially through a policy that allowed certain clans to seize territory from others. The Siad Barre regime was very unpopular. It was supported primarily through arms and money shipments, from the East and from the West during the Cold War. And when the Cold War ended, it collapsed. And when it did that in 1991, there was an explosion of violence, of famine, strong effort by the international community to intervene to resolve the war and to resolve the humanitarian crisis that resulted from it. And at the same time, there was a wave of migration from the north of the country down to the south. In particular, the capital city of Mogadishu, which had primarily belonged to the Darod clan, was pretty much seized by the Hawaya, and as many as 400,000 people were driven out of the city. So that Mogadishu essentially changed hands. And those land seizures are the fundamental heart of why the Somali conflict has been so persistent. What we've seen in Somalia amounts to something very similar in many respects to the genocide in Rwanda. It's not an ethnic conflict per se, because all Somalis are ethnically Somali, but the clan identities have become so entrenched and the grievances have become so entrenched that what we're really talking about is an ethnic conflict that simply hasn't been resolved. There's good news in there, believe it or not. Basically, after the Black Hawk Down incident, which everyone remembers, it's been immortalized in a film, and it's definitely been emblazoned on the American national consciousness as sort of the start of our difficult relationship with Africa, and Somalia in particular. But basically, after the Black Hawk Down incident, the United States more or less turned its back on Somalia. The country was effectively ostracized, really for 6 or 7 years, up until the early 2000s. And during that period, the Somalis, by themselves, without really any international support, started making a great deal of progress on the ground towards resolving these conflicts. And it's a fact that's almost consistently overlooked when we talk about Somalia, is the fact that between 1995 and 2001, the conflict in the country shifted from being a huge factional war between clans to being a series of extremely localized turf battles, for the most part, between sub-clans. And the economy, which was devastated by the collapse of the Siad Barre regime and the war, actually restarted in many parts of the country. The livestock trade was revitalized, telecommunications industries sprang up, and what happened was the war economy began to shift towards a regular economy. The other wonderful thing that happened was, without a lot of assistance from the outside, the extremist groups that had worried the United States in the 1990s, like Al-Ittihad, which was attached to Al-Qaeda, went away. They pretty much collapsed because Somalia was just so inhospitable to those groups. So basically a whole roster of great things happened. Somalia's economy was on par with the rest of the region, militant groups went dormant, and the conflict started to reduce. So it was on a pretty good trajectory.
Yeah, so it's a fact that's often overlooked, isn't it? That there was some good things happening in the 90s in Somalia. We tend to think of it as this kind of ungoverned, anarchic sort of society. But as you say, you look below the national level, and interesting things were going on during that period. Yeah,
exactly so. So then, of course, obviously it begs the real question, which is what happened if U.S. intelligence was writing as late as 2006, actually, that Somalia was inoculated against groups like Al-Qaeda because it's just, it's a clan culture, they're averse to foreigners, it's a flat terrain, they don't like external radical religious ideologies. What happened between then and now, where we have the Shabaab, this militant Islamist youth movement that's essentially terrorizing the country? And the short answer, which I've delved into in much more detail in my writing, but the short answer is counter-terror policy happened to it. Basically, after 9/11, the U.S. became very concerned about Somalia being an ungoverned space, and they were worried that Al-Qaeda might find a safe haven there. And so there were multiple attempts to construct a government for Somalia. The current one is, as Richard mentioned, the Transitional Federal Government, or TFG. But basically, when the TFG was created, the initial counter-reaction that was produced inside Somalia was the formation of the Shabaab, which was a radical, marginal fringe group that pretty much existed to assassinate sympathizers of the TFG and international aid workers. The TFG is a struggling institution. It never really managed to implant itself fully in Somalia. And it's very possible that if it had just been left alone to sort of die a natural death, the Shabaab too would have petered away. But in early 2006, U.S. counterterror operatives decided to back a coalition of warlords in Somalia, specifically for the purpose of finding these radicals and delivering them outside to the United States. And this group, called the Alliance for the Restoration of Peace and Counterterrorism, was so unpopular with Somalis that it basically produced a revolt inside Mogadishu. And that revolt provided the opportunity for something called the Union of Islamic Courts to seize power in Mogadishu and to spread its power throughout Somalia. Again, the Union of Islamic Courts wasn't necessarily the worst thing that could have happened to the country, but with some prompting from Ethiopia, and the United States decided that the Union of Islamic Courts was linked to al-Qaeda. And as it became more and more aggressive towards the TFG, which was never popular to begin with, a decision was made that Ethiopia would invade the country. The invasion itself might not have been too terrible, but Ethiopia decided to occupy Mogadishu. And when it occupied Mogadishu, in order to ensure that the TFG would be able to stay in the capital city, it provoked a complex insurgency. And the Shabaab, which had been regarded by most people as a fringe group that was unpopular, that was promoting a non-Somali set of values, that was restrictive, that was preventing Somalis from living the way that they wanted to live, all of a sudden became a popular resistance movement. And from being a fringe group, it suddenly became a mainstream political group movement. And that's pretty much how we've gotten to where we are today. So basically, I think that the argument that we can put forward is that Somalia has a set of problems that are entrenched and difficult, but that the current crisis is really related to a second set of problems. And those set of problems are not rooted in Somalia, but they're really rooted in international policy towards the country.
Let's, Bronwyn, if you take a step back to this period in the 1990s up to 2001, that you suggest there was a lot of a degree of optimism during that time, and that entrepreneurial activity was going on, the economy picked up, and that some sort of, at least at a local and community level, there was some form of government going on, and that there was no real sort of presence of extremists. Yet at the same time, we know that we had these terrible bombings of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania back in 1998, and there's always been suggestions that the people involved, although not Somali necessarily, may have operated either from Somalia or gone back there. Similarly, in 2001, when you had a missile attack on an Israeli aircraft near Mombasa, and an attack on a hotel in near Mombasa as well. Similarly, people have made those links to terrorists or terrorist suspects, Al-Qaeda linked suspects, again operating from Somalia. So does this not suggest that if there was, you may be right, there was no domestic powerful extremist Islamist movement, but the dangers of disengaging from Somalia became apparent because these people were allowed to use Somalia as a base, this sort of lawless place that they were able to freely operate from there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and that's a really good, it's a good point to raise. I think it is important to distinguish between sort of Somalia as a haven where terrorists run after they've done something horrible, and Somalia's value as an operational platform.
Right.
Somalia has not been useful as an operational platform. I don't think it's ever been used as a launching pad for attacks, because it's really impossible for people to keep things secret in Somalia before they happen. And it's a lawless territory, and it makes it very hard for organized groups to operate there. The perpetrators of the 1998 embassy bombings certainly did flee into Somalia after the attacks, and they were able to hide there and ultimately to escape, many of them. So of course that did raise concerns. But a lot of the concern about Somalia, I think, has been sort of a theoretical concern about ungoverned spaces in general. Very little about the worries, very little of the worry about Somalia has been based in an actual examination of the country itself. I mean, there's just a sort of mentality that nation building is the best response to terrorism, and ungoverned spaces will allow, criminal activities to take root. They'll allow terrorist ideologies to take root.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the Somali context, the actual truth of the matter is what's actually most allowed terrorist ideologies to flourish in Somalia is the intrusiveness of international attempts to impose order on the country, to impose a political solution on the politics of Somalia, and to really pick a winner in the conflict. And it's basically the thesis of my work that in order to stop Somalia's downward spiral, the very first thing that the United States should do is to step back from the conflict and to say, basically, we're not going to interfere in your politics. We're not going to try to pick a winner in the country. And if you come up with an Islamist government, we're going to coexist with it because we don't want to be the ones who are imposing a solution. And that if we do that, it's very, very likely that the situation will normalize and that we'll get back to that positive trajectory that we saw before 9/11 in the country.
A couple of follow-up questions on your last point there.
Mm-hmm.
Is it realistic, do you think, for the United States to step back from Somalia, knowing that it's currently a big battle for control is going on there right now, and that you have this proven extremist group, which only very recently, a couple of months back, announced that it had formally linked up with Al-Qaeda? Can the United States realistically step back and say, well, if they're the group that eventually takes control, then so be it? Is that a viable option, do you think?
Yeah. I would say that in my sense of it is that the war on terror is kind of a two-headed monster. And on the one hand, you have the head that's really focused on fighting the war on terror. It's covert operations, it's kinetic counter-terror activities where people are sneaking in a country and killing the bad guys. And I think from the war on terror performance perspective, it's very, very feasible and rational to disengage and let all of the internal fissures in the Shabaab play themselves out. A majority of experts on Somalia and a lot of officials speaking off the record will tell you that they really believe that that is the case, that if the Shabaab were left to itself, it would collapse, because it, as a movement, is so riddled with internal conflicts that it just cannot sustain itself. Now, that said, the other head of the war on terror is the performance of the war, the press, the reputation of politicians, and the need for Obama in particular to be seen to be fighting Al-Qaeda. And from that perspective, it would be really difficult for the U.S. to just throw up its hands and say the smartest thing to do is walk away, because the average American reading a newspaper article about this horrible group, the Shabaab, is going to want to see a line in there somewhere that says the U.S. government is doing X, and the line the U.S. government is doing nothing. It is not very satisfying. And so the political reality is that it's really tough for policymakers to do what they pretty much accept is the right thing.
And of course, you're not suggesting, are you, that the U.S. gives up its policy of, surgical strikes against Al-Qaeda suspects within Somalia? That would continue irrespective of the diplomatic policy towards Somalia, right?
Yeah, and I have to say I'm a recent convert to that view, because during the Bush administration there were a number of airstrikes against terror targets in Somalia, and they wiped out dozens of civilians. And when you have that approach, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or in Somalia, when your counter-terror activities are killing innocent bystanders, obviously, the effect is not to reduce radicalization. The effect is maybe to kill one bad guy and to create 20 more. And that was very clearly happening in the Somali context. Under the Obama administration recently, they had an airstrike against a high-profile target, and they managed to kill him without killing any innocent civilians in the process. And when they did that, surprisingly, the reaction from the Somalis was pretty much, it didn't really bother anybody at all, which on the one hand is a demonstration that these guys are not rooted in the community, and they can be wiped out without the Somalis being too concerned about it, as long as we don't kill any Somalis in the process.
Right. So you think it's possible to separate the foreign fighters, the foreign al-Qaeda-linked operatives, I guess, from the Somali population itself? And you think Somalis make that distinction and say, okay, it's all right to take out these guys, but we'll at least give our tacit approval of that. But if you go any closer and try and take out the local guys, it's a different matter entirely.
It absolutely is, and it sort of edges onto a very important point about the way that we're describing the Shabaab in Somalia. The Shabaab is not a monolithic movement. It's composed of a bunch of thugs, businessmen, clan interests, and there are only really a few people at the very top who are foreigners who are linked to al-Qaeda, and there's only a small core of people who really have transnational goals. The vast majority of the Shabaab are opportunistic and nationalist actors. And the United States, when it's engaged in Afghanistan and when it's engaged in Iraq, has gone through a vital process of learning. In the Iraq conflict, in Sadr City, for example, the U.S. reached a turning point when it reached out to militants that it figured out were extremists, but not transnationally oriented. And in Afghanistan, the U.S. is making a similar evolution in thinking. It's now reaching out to low and mid-level members of the Taliban and saying, you know, these guys, they don't like us, maybe they have extremist views, but they're not our enemies. And I think in Somalia, the U.S. needs to make a similar distinction between people we don't like and people who are our enemies that we have to fight a war with. And I think that if we do that, the conflict in Somalia from a U.S. perspective will start looking very manageable and very small indeed.
To push you on this point again, do you think, again, this is rather an optimistic strategy to assume that Shabaab will just sort of fall apart and disintegrate, just provided the US takes a step backwards? I mean, could we talk, for example, about the humanitarian situation right now in Somalia?
Sure.
It was notable recently that in the southern part of the country where al-Shabaab has its sort of strongholds, the World Food Programme has had to admit defeat essentially and say we cannot deliver anymore, we can't deliver food aid to this part of the country because of interference from al-Shabaab. They're demanding bribes, they won't let women workers operate here, and their staff are under threat of attack and violence. So all of this suggests that the movement is becoming more rather than less extreme. Is there not a danger of disengagement leading to more extremism, that this movement could just kind of spiral out of control?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that certainly any strategy in Somalia has risks. I can't think of anything that the international community has done in the country that hasn't backfired in a fairly grievous way. But, you know, I think that an initial risk of the strategy would be that for a month or 6 months or a year, it would appear that the Shabaab was consolidating and gaining ground, most likely. And it would take a certain period of time for the cracks to really make themselves felt. That said, the current policy in which we've identified the Shabaab and the whole of the Shabaab as a terrorist group has led to this situation where the World Food Programme, which is providing desperately needed food assistance to millions of Somalis, I mean, approximately 40% of the population needs this food aid in order to survive. But the World Food Programme has been forced to stop its operations because of fears that some of this food relief is making its way to armed militant groups. Now, the WFP has its own problems with the Shabaab. They don't make it easy to operate, but those problems have always been there, and it's a really good chance that the WFP would be able to negotiate with the Shabaab and resume its activities, you know, during the normal course of events. It's been an ongoing problem. Instead, what we have is a situation where food aid is not getting through. And the stoppage of food aid and the fact that so many people are starving as a result of it is actually yet another thing that's going to increase radicalization and make the Somalis feel that they're a victim of the war on terror and not the beneficiaries of U.S. efforts to prevent these bad guys from taking hold. And that's a really big problem for U.S. policy. It's particularly bad when you think that while the U.S. is concerned about food finding its way into the bad guys' hands, arms shipments to the TFG are continuing, and we know very well that many of those arms are finding their way onto the black market where they're being bought by the Shabaab. So it's really tough, I think. It puts the U.S. in a very unenviable position to say food no, guns yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn now to the TFG, the Transitional Federal Government, which the US is supporting, along with other nations, not only in the region, but the UN and other organizations. Explain to me why in your view, they're such a failed organization, and why you really see no prospect for them gaining ground and widespread support in Somalia. Why are they doomed to failure, in your view?
Yeah. It's very fashionable when you talk about Somalia to point out the fact that there have been 14 or 15 reconciliation attempts and attempts to construct a government in the country. That number, there's a great Somali group that's recently done a debunking of that number, which is fantastic. But the fact remains that there have been a lot of efforts to try to create a government, and they've always failed. And the simple reason is that the things we talked about in the beginning, the land seizures and the clan conflicts, are unresolved. And until they're resolved, the government in Somalia is primarily going to be seen as the means for one group to capture resources from everybody else.
Right.
And that's really the case with Sheikh Sharif's government, which has now become perceived as dominated by a single clan. And on top of that, the TFG, very much like the Shabaab, is not a cohesive entity. It doesn't have a political ideology that's coherent. It just is really a coalition of fortune. These guys are working together because the international community is funneling power and money to them. And when that stops, they're going to fall apart.
But do you think you're calling time on them too early in some respects? I mean, the latest formation of the TFG is a bit broader than the previous one. Sheikh Sharif took office, I suppose you could say, more than a year ago now. People at the time predicted he wouldn't still be here today. He still is. And only recently, a more moderate, I guess, Sufi-inspired Islamic group has joined forces with the TFG as well, and said that it is willing to fight Shabaab and other extremist groups. So in some ways, the TFG is a little bit broader in scope than it was definitely a couple of years ago. Do you think, are we being too quick to say there's no prospect of them taking control in Somalia?
In some respects, I would say yes, only in the sense that it's really clear that the African Union, and Ethiopia in particular, and the United Nations is still a strong backer of the TFG. And as long as a lot of the international community is still backing this entity, it doesn't do a lot of good for the U.S. to just say, no, we're going in on our own, and we're going to let them die. However, I would point out that Sheikh Sharif is still in office, and the TFG is still alive, because there is a ring of international soldiers that's protecting them. AMISOM, the African Union mission to Somalia. Those peacekeepers are a target for the Shabaab. The Shabaab fires at them, and in response, the TFG and AMISOM hits a mortar back, and they always hit densely populated urban neighborhoods, so that there have been massive casualties of innocent civilians as the TFG and the Shabaab have fought each other. Now, there is an absolute stalemate between them. There's no chance that the TFG is going to take control of the country. And likewise, there's precious little chance that the Shabaab is going to oust the African peacekeepers. So what you have is not a government that's functioning in any way. It doesn't control anything more than a few blocks of Mogadishu, doesn't deliver services to the population, doesn't collect taxes. It doesn't protect Somalis from the Shabaab. It doesn't prevent al-Qaeda from forming safe havens throughout the country. So it doesn't do any of the things that the United States or the Somali people really care about. But what it does is decrease the security of the average citizen, and it provides a rallying point for extremist forces that would ordinarily not have very much to agree about. So effectively, their presence is prolonging the conflict, and that hurts U.S. interests. So yeah, I don't think it's too soon to pull the plug. Okay. I really don't.
Well, let's talk about the central point you make in your report and this policy you're suggesting, putting forward of what you call constructive disengagement. Just explain to us what that actually means in policy terms. How would it work out?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll make this the last point before we turn over to general discussion. But, constructive disengagement, I would really just want to emphasize more than anything else, is not a policy of fencing off Somalia and leaving the Somalians alone with their problems. Constructive disengagement is effectively a solution that says a lot of Somalia's problems are caused by the interference of regional and international actors. And Somalia needs to be given the space to resolve its own problems, as it was doing before 2001. It means that there will continue, as you pointed out, to be some selective counter-terror operations. There are bad guys in Somalia who need to be taken out. They're not Somalis, they're people who are capitalizing on the conflict and importing chaos and violence. And they're bad people. And I have no problem with getting rid of them. It means, constructive disengagement means that the United States has to make efforts to defend Somalia from incursions by Ethiopia, by Kenya, by any actor, including Eritrea, for example, that has malign designs on the country. And finally, constructive disengagement does involve internal activities. In the first place, it involves a posture of coexistence with the Shabaab, as long as they agree to certain behavioral conditions. And it means focusing on development. I really believe that development is the best thing that the United States can be doing in Somalia, that economic incentives for cooperation among the clans and humanitarian relief that allow people to get on with the business of living and ultimately will provide a solution for Somalia that is not a radical Islamist solution. Right. Are the only real effective way forward. And that's a long-term solution. It's not going to look good in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. But we can't go on with Somalia in another 2 decades looking the way it does now.
As you say, the policy options are fairly limited, aren't they? It's really choosing the least bad option in many ways, I suppose.
Absolutely.
And with that, we'll open the floor to questions. I'm sure you've got comments and questions and responses to this really interesting, thought-provoking presentation.
Thanks.
Over to you. Yes?
You mentioned that there was some belief at some point in maybe the Bush administration, I don't know if Obama's carried this over, that the courts, the Islamic courts, had infiltration somehow of the al-Qaeda. What is that based on? Do you know, was that based on any sound intelligence or just sort of Cheney's weird paradigm constructions that he did?
Sure. Maybe Richard will have a different sense of this, but my sense is that primarily it was based on information that was being fed to the Bush administration by Ethiopia. Ethiopia has an existential fear of a strong Islamist state reemerging in Somalia because it has a sort of Muslim, Christian, Somali, Ethiopian conflict occurring in one of its regions. There are people like Sheikh Hassan Dahir Owais, who have been identified by the United States as wanted terrorists, who in Somalia are known to have more of a nationalist perspective. He's an extremist, but he really has a nationalist point of view. And his involvement with the courts and the involvement of some of his protégés who had spent time in Afghanistan and other conflicts was a source of concern. And in particular, the fact that the Union of Islamic Courts had the Shabaab was acting as its military wing at the time. And that military wing was imposing a lot of very harsh policies, banning music, banning football games, banning movies, that it made them look like they were really an extremist organization. And worst of all, some of the rhetoric coming out of the Islamic Courts Union, even though it was really sort of blustering and you hear it all the time, involved reclaiming Somali territories from Ethiopia and other neighboring countries. And the renewal of those irredentist claims really makes the neighborhood nervous. So that sort of combination of beliefs and also the aggressiveness of the Bush administration in confronting what it perceived as terror threats really combined to cause the Ethiopian invasion.
Yeah, I essentially would go along with that. The courts were a very broad umbrella movement, and under that movement there were undoubtedly individuals of concern to the United States there. I mean, the courts didn't help, the more extremist fringes of the courts didn't help themselves, as you said, by making very belligerent claims against Ethiopia, and that provided Ethiopia with the sort of really didn't need much excuse to intervene in Somalia, but they were provided it in that respect. And it's true that some of the extremist fringes, there were people that the United States does want for international terrorism offences, and they were being shielded by this group. But there were definitely at the same time a wide broad range of people that the US could have engaged with more effectively, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Michael Kurtzig, formerly of USDA, now an educator. Could you comment a little bit about the hijackings, the kidnappings? How does that impact the economy? It seems to me they're making millions of dollars and they should be doing very well.
Yeah.
How do we protect against that? And I might note that this morning apparently there was an attempted hijacking and they killed the hijacker. And so the United Nations, for some idiotic reasoning, is saying who are these people on the boat responsible to? Who are they? Who's in charge of them? But it seems like a little Wild West show over there. And
Yeah.
besides that, I wanted to know, you may have answered it in the previous question, how destabilizing is the Somalia situation to the whole region?
Yeah. Basically, there's been a lot of talk about piracy, and I would say, the statistics you get vary and they're more or less reliable, but generally people believe that last year the Somali pirates took about $150 million in ransoms, which in the scope of international shipping industry is not that much money, $150 million.
That must be mostly what the economy is based on, it sounds like.
Surprisingly it's not. A lot of the money that the pirates take goes overseas. The sort of the international financiers of the pirate industries take about 50% of the profits. And a lot of the local Somalis, they take their cut and they instantly depart for Kenya or for Yemen and then onwards into the Middle Eastern countries. So there's been, there are towns in Somalia that are looking a whole lot better than they used to as a result of pirate money, where you see fancy SUVs and houses, but that's pretty localized, and Somalia is certainly not writing its economy on the back of pirate activities. And I would point out in terms of sort of the $150 million that the pirates took, I think the estimate of the cost of the international response to piracy is something like $1.825 billion a year. So it's a little disproportionate. There's been an increasing focus on onboard security measures that the shipping industry can take, and they've been very effective so far. And there's increasing focus on land-based responses to piracy, which is also a really positive development and fruitful. But it's slow. And the only thing you can really do is keep in mind the context. Piracy is a nuisance, but it's not necessarily a devastating one. Do you want to take the second question?
Yes. If you remind me what exactly it was again. The
problem in Somalia destabilizes the whole region. What is the impact of Sudan and Kenya?
Right. Yeah. It's a hugely destabilizing impact. The key relationship, I think, is the Ethiopia-Eritrea dynamic. Essentially, they're using Somalia as a sort of proxy battleground right now. The two countries, Ethiopia and Eritrea, were at war just under a decade ago over their boundary, their common border. That issue's never been resolved despite the intervention of the UN. And now the two countries, number one foreign policy aim is to destabilize each other, and by any means necessary. And so in Somalia, therefore, you've had accusations that Eritrea has been funneling weapons and funding to Al-Shabaab. The links aren't quite as strong, perhaps, as have been presented, but there's definitely been a malevolent influence in Somalia from Eritrea. Likewise, Ethiopia funds opposition groups that are wishing to destabilize the regime in Asmara. So I think you have to take, if policymakers have to adopt a regional approach when they look at Somalia and really see resolving the underlying hostility between Ethiopia and Eritrea as being a real root cause of what's going on. If that issue can be resolved in any sort of useful way, that would have positive impacts throughout the region, I think. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you go along with that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Another big regional problem is the flow of refugees out of Somalia, and that's hitting Kenya particularly hard. And again, that is really a result of the conflict between the TFG and the Shabaab, which I would really pose as being kind of an artificial conflict in the sense that they're two sides that probably wouldn't exist but for these international external pressures. It's also worth pointing out, another fact that's very frequently overlooked is that many countries in the region actually benefit significantly from Somalia's instability and its security vacuum. I read a fascinating statistic the other day. A Middle Eastern country that I won't name imports 4 saris for every Somali woman in the country, basically. And I can guarantee to you that Somali women are not buying imported clothing. And what's happening, obviously, is that these things are going straight through without any taxes or duties into Kenya. So the Middle East is using it as a way to funnel goods through East Africa. And Kenya, in return, is exporting a huge amount of drugs into Somalia. The cot trade produces millions and millions of dollars of revenue for the country. So there are pluses and minuses, I think, regionally to Somalia's ongoing lack of government. But I mean, it's a very complicated picture, and it's hard to just sort of draw fast and hard rules about it.
Thank you. Abraham Avidor, formerly with the Foreign Agricultural Service. If you look at the map of Africa, you'll find out to your amazement that Somalia has the longest coastline in the continent. And unfortunately, the young people, many of whom are unemployed, are reluctant to go into fishery. And instead, they stay where they are and they resort to piracy, hijacking, other illegal activities. The question is, what can be done to encourage them to obtain gainful employment in fishery, which will go a long way to solve the employment problem and other problems, overall problems of Somalia? Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, sure.
My name is Daib Shigamet. I'm with Universal TV in North America. I wanted just to make a point, which is you mentioned earlier, said Sheikh Sharif government, it belonged to one clan. I believe Sheikh Sharif government, when we held it in Djibouti, it pays 4.5, which is everybody, Somali clan is in it. Can you just specifically explain why you mean that, and for that, thank you.
Sure.
And my answer is actually a follow-up to my question is actually a follow-up to the question of the gentleman. That I really buy very much into your idea of constructive disengagement and how most of the intervention should be based on humanitarian development needs. However, from experience from Iraq and Afghanistan, the binding constraint really is the security situation. And any humanitarian / developmental intervention would require a huge chunk of the budget to be allocated to the military. And like it or not, we might still end up with another Iraq or another Afghanistan just because of the nature of the problem. So do you think that can be avoidable?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great questions. And you can help me answer them.
Sure, okay.
if you want to.
Sure. Well, tackling the piracy question first, I think you're right. I mean, you look at the length of the coastline, you realise the size of the problem. Although, to be fair, it is concentrated in specific areas. One of the original motivations the pirates claimed was that they were trying to protect their fishing stocks from illegal fishing. These trawlers from many parts of the world fishing off the coast of Somalia and literally taking away Somalia's resources from under its noses. So it's interesting that the international community only became interested in the offshore parts of Somalia when the piracy started, and that they've done very little. They've been very proactive in tackling piracy and fairly effective, I would say. But yet they're completely uninterested in tackling one of the underlying issues, which is the illegal fishing. So I think the international community should make more of an overt effort to at least show that they're tackling this issue, and then perhaps you might encourage Somalis. It's a very optimistic aim, but maybe you would, stocks would be replenished and Somalis would be more encouraged to take up fishing again.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of your question, I mean, it's a really good, it's a good question and it's a bad problem. Development and humanitarian relief in the Somali context is really difficult. There's absolutely no question about it. And the World Food Programme's problems really demonstrate that. And the UN Monitoring Group's report, which came out recently, claiming that as much as 50% of food aid is being diverted to crooks and to the Shabaab and to corrupt, contractors. At the same time, there are wide swaths of Somalia where that kind of thing isn't a problem, where the security situation actually isn't that bad. And I would point out that the WFP has been operating in Somalia for years, while this conflict has been ongoing, without any protection whatsoever from the African Union peacekeepers. In fact, the WFP has had to keep as far away from them as they possibly can, because cooperation will sort of tag them as, a combatant sort of allied entity. So it's not impossible. And I think basically that what you have to do is make sure that you get protection from the powers on the ground. Somalia is lawless, but it's not chaotic in many places. I mean, there's no formal laws, but there are people in control. Sometimes that's the Shabaab. If you can find in your political strategy some way to interact with the Shabaab, you can get a lot done. If you can find in your political strategy ways to interact with traditional authorities and business leaders and what we frequently call warlords in the Somali context, whether that's a good term to use or not, then you really have an opportunity to go in and get a lot done. Now, it requires international agencies to be very forgiving and flexible in their expectations and to sort of turn a blind eye very occasionally to diversions of funds. That's normal in a conflict zone. It's particularly bad in Somalia, but it's not an impossible problem to get over. It just requires a lot of patience and a lot of skill and frankly some new approaches to development that we really haven't tried before, but they're long overdue in any case.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, but it's an exceptionally tough operating environment and an exhausting effort to have to negotiate on a local level with each of the groups, on a microscopic level almost, and these groups are changing and shifting all the time as well. So it's a constant process of a battle, it's a tough environment.
It really is.
Yeah.
Can you answer
Oh yes,
yes,
I'm so
the
sorry.
ratio,
I'm so sorry.
The question of the ratio. Sorry, we weren't deliberately ignoring you.
Yeah, no, I'm so sorry about that. Basically, yeah, I mean, the 4.5 system was set up a long time ago, before the current sort of iteration of Sheikh Sharif's regime. And what it means is basically that there are 4 major clan families in Somalia, and then there are minority clans. So 4.5 is a way of sort of allotting representation in the government to the clans. The major clans get 4 sort of shares, and the minority clans get a half a share. Now, in theory, what that is intended to do is to provide equal representation in the government. So when it comes to resolving the land disputes, for example, ideally everyone has a fair say in how things are resolved. But in practice, it's really hard to determine legitimate representation. Someone can be seated in a Darod seat and really be linked to Hawaiian business interests, or vice versa. And I think the concern also is that some positions in the government are much more important than others. And if the important positions are being dominated by one clan as opposed to equally shared, then there is a perception that those interests have more of a say in how things are managed than was intended by that egalitarian structure. A lot of Somalis have a real problem, and I don't speak for them clearly, but a lot of them have a real problem with a system of government that's effectively based on an ethnic quota. It's fundamentally undemocratic, and in practice it really hasn't worked very well. And you might wish to respond to that, but...
Well, I don't know if we have time for one more question, but no? We have to wrap it up, unfortunately. But well, thanks very much for great questions and a great presentation from Bronwyn, who's I think has raised you know, a lot of new thinking on how we approach this tangled issue, and I particularly like her approach. You know, obviously we all agree on one thing, which is that current policy isn't working, but you know, Bronwyn's tried to follow this through and come up with some solutions, and I think she's right to stress this argument that less is sometimes more. You know, that interventions are never impartial and that they can aggravate situations, and US policy towards Somalia, particularly in the best part of this decade, is proof of that. And also I think Bronwyn makes an important point about avoiding overt nation building strategies, and this bottom-up approach of building governance from local levels I think is important. And finally, the point that is obvious, but a very important one nonetheless, that US foreign policy in not just in Somalia but in Africa in general should not be approached through this sort of narrow anti-terrorism lens, and I think that's an important point which needs reinforcing. So perhaps you join with me in thanking Bronwyn for her time and interest in the subject. Thank you.